Welcome to the Urbanist Agenda, the podcast that wants a better Los Angeles. I'm Jason from Not Just Bikes, and I'm joined today by Ellory Smith. Welcome to the show, Ellery.
Thank you so much for having me. Long-time listener.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was really excited to hear that. So we were introduced to each other recently through Nicole, who has done some writing for me in the past, because I was launching a new YouTube channel. And I specifically asked Nicole for people who were urbanists who lived in a city and who were funny. And you were on that list.
I'm honored. Truly.
Yeah, indeed. Well, so if you haven't heard of it yet, and you probably haven't because it just launched, the new channel is called I Love the City. And it's kind of like a comedy urbanism channel that's on YouTube and Nebula. And Ellery is one of the writers on the team. And she wrote actually the second episode, which should be on Nebula right now, about libraries and why you should go to them.
Yeah, I'm a big public library fan, and I'm a huge Los Angeles public library fan. I live here in Los Angeles, and our system is truly one of the most robust and has incredible amenities that you would never even guess.
Yeah, I was surprised that Los Angeles has that kind of library, but I've been going to the library more recently because my kids are at the age where they have to go to the library for one reason or another. And our library near us is actually really great too. It has, like you said in the video, it has like maker spaces and it has like workshops and all this other stuff that you wouldn't necessarily expect from a library.
I think libraries in general have really expanded their list of services. I think that's twofold. I think primarily because they're seeing fewer people, and so they're trying to reach more demographics.
Yeah.
I think they've done a really good job of that. And then secondarily, at least in America, because of the, this is me editorializing, but because of the breakdown of social services, the library has expanded to cover certain areas of aid that they might not have covered previously.
Yeah. It was actually really interesting, but I'm not going to give too much of it away because
you can watch the video.
Yeah, you can go watch it on I Love the City right now on Nebula, and it'll be on YouTube in 2 weeks' time. So yeah, that's the new channel, I Love the City, comedy urbanism channel, and I'd love to see how it goes. It's going to be really interesting because we have brought on some very talented comedians like Ellery, and I think that's one of the things I really like about the channel is that it's funny because I don't write the jokes, and it works out much better that way. But the other reason I wanted to have you on here was to talk about Los Angeles, because when I talked to Nicole about people who would be a good fit for writing for a comedy urbanism YouTube channel, obviously the comedy part is important, and you have done that. Actually, maybe we can talk about that very briefly. What is some of the comedy stuff that you've done in the past?
Sure. So I'm a stand-up comedian and TV writer. I worked on 7 seasons of a Adult Swim show called Robot Chicken.
It is so damn funny, Robot Chicken.
Thank you. That's very sweet.
My kids are so am I, absolutely obsessed with that very old episode when the Emperor gets a call from Darth Vader that the Death Star got blown up.
Yeah.
That is so goddamn funny.
That was before my time, just by a little bit, but
I figured as much.
I was so honored to be there for so long, and I love those guys, and that is like some of the work I'm most proud of. We got a bunch of Emmy nominations while I was there, which just felt professionally awesome. And other than that, I'm a stand-up comedian based in Los Angeles, and I do a lot of local comedy, and I'm also very community involved.
Yeah, indeed. That's amazing. I mean, like, seriously incredible to be able to work on a show that's nominated for an Emmy too, right? Like, that's got to be like...
I got very lucky. I feel very blessed. I love animation. That's sort of the space that I try to own and prefer to work in. And it was very special to me to be able to work in stop motion animation, which is frankly a really belabored process that takes hundreds of people to make work. And it's really, talk about community oriented. It's like you need a whole village to make one of those episodes.
It is remarkable that they did that show as stop motion. Like, I think that makes
remarkable
it funnier
and
too,
expensive.
Right? Yeah, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you got the budget for it, it does make it funnier, though, in a way. Like, the whole feel of it feels a little bit silly.
I think so. Definitely. We're all toy fans. We're makers. We're fans of construction, toy engineering. And
right.
I think that brings a lot to it, is like the nostalgia that's involved with toys and making them, have a second life.
It's amazing. Very, very funny show anyway. Yeah, I love that. So yeah, as I said, it's important to have 2 things for a comedy urbanism show. The first is the comedy, which you definitely have. And the other one was the urbanism. And that was a little bit tricky because like when I was talking to Nicole, because Nicole worked on The Daily Show and several other shows. So she knows a lot of comedians. She's a stand-up comedian herself. So she knows lots of comedians, but the trick is finding comedian urbanists. And I think you really fit the bill because,
Well, so does Nicole, frankly.
well, yeah, so does Nicole. Absolutely. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to write for the
She's
show.
a little busy.
Yeah, she's crazy busy, actually. She writes for Climate Town, but she still does The Daily Show, of course. And she has her own podcast. And like, she is busy all the time. So yeah, don't blame her for that. But she also knows some very funny people. So it worked out well. But yeah, so you also live in Los Angeles, of course, but you work for a nonprofit called Streets for All. So tell us about that.
Sure. So I am the director of outreach and organizing for Streets for All.
Cool.
It's my current full-time job. Basically, we are a transportation and mobility nonprofit. We think that our air doesn't have to be polluted and we don't have to have the highest rates of childhood asthma or Los Angeles.
Imagine that.
I know. I mean, the adverse health effects from traffic are very real and they're very holistic. They overlap with a lot of different issues. And, like, you know, we think that people can live happier and healthier lives and that we can prioritize all types of mobility.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds fantastic, honestly. I think that's the kind of organization that every city should have. It really is shocking to me how little we talk about air pollution when it comes to cars. Like, we just kind of just take it as a given that it's just going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's true of a lot of things related to cars. It's like, because we know that people in Los Angeles, it's the equivalent of smoking like 4 cigarettes a day. We have the highest rates of childhood asthma. You know, we have inflated cancer rates, specifically near certain neighborhoods that are closer to certain highways than others. And we also have a lot of traffic violence. And I think both adverse health effects and traffic violence are things that are baked into car culture that we just take as a given. We know that it happens, and for some reason it doesn't really upset us culturally. We're just so used to those side effects, I guess you might say.
Yeah, I guess the thing is, like, even when I've brought up that kind of topic, I haven't talked about air pollution specifically on its own in a video, but I have talked about it here and there over the years. And when it comes up, a lot of it is just like, well, you know, that's the cost of mobility. What are we going to do? I'll go back to horses or something. And it's frustrating.
Yeah, especially given that there are so many options now for mobility. And when presented with those options, people typically utilize them. And so that on its own eases traffic a little bit. And it also encourages holistic exercising, getting outside and walking to a metro stop or riding a bike, something like that.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I have been to Los Angeles many times. I've also sat in traffic in Los Angeles many times. I used to live in California, actually. I lived in Northern California in the Bay Area.
Oh, wow. Where?
I lived in Sunnyvale for a while.
Okay.
Yeah, because I worked in Sunnyvale.
I was going to say, not a lot out there.
No, there's nothing going on in Sunnyvale. Although what I will say is that the name is accurate. It is very sunny, and it is apparently like the most days of sunshine of any place in the Bay Area, like that little microclimate there. There's a lot of sun in Sunnyvale, but it's, oh my God, is it boring? There is nothing going on there. But yeah, and then I lived in a couple other places like Milpitas and San Mateo. I never did live in San Francisco because I always worked down in Silicon Valley. This is a long time ago, though. This is like 98, 99, back when Silicon Valley still had silicon and it wasn't just Facebook. So it was a very different time back then. But I did drive around California a lot. I had a very good friend of mine who was living down in Los Angeles, and I used to go down to see him. And the thing with Los Angeles that really kind of annoys me is that, you know, when I talk on my channel about cycling or public transit or walking or walkable neighborhoods and all that kind of thing, like, especially as a Canadian, the number one thing that comes up is the weather. Everyone jumps to the weather as the excuse. It's like, oh, it's cold and it's raining and I have to carry 2 tons of steel everywhere I go. But the weather in Los Angeles,
Perfect.
I mean, it's basically perfect, right?
Yeah. It would be the best city in the world if you could bike everywhere. It's the perfect city for biking, so it's why.
It's relatively flat, too. Like, I know it has the hills and stuff.
Some parts, the east side of Los Angeles can get very hilly,
Yes.
but the west side is like gorgeous, flat. We have like 5 days of rain a year, maybe. It's like 75 right now. It's December 14th.
It's honestly a tragedy. It's an absolute tragedy.
It is. It's a tragedy. It's a travesty. And I think if people realize what they're being robbed of, and how it's just like, Los Angeles is one of my favorite places in the world. I've lived here almost 10 years. And I want people to enjoy it the way that I enjoy it, which is outside.
Yeah.
And it feels like we're really missing something that could elevate everybody's experience.
Yeah, it is very frustrating. So back to Streets for All. So it must be a little bit challenging to promote car alternatives in Los Angeles. I mean, anywhere in North America, really. But Los Angeles is kind of infamous for the car culture. And I know that it's not all like that, having been there. Like, I know that it has like a pretty decent metro system too. But like, do you find like you get a lot of pushback on Streets for All on this stuff, or are people receptive to it?
I think overall people are very receptive to it. I think there's a lot of political will for change in this arena. I think a lot of people are hungry to see it. We recently, this past March had a ballot measure called Measure HLA, Measure Healthy Streets LA.
Yeah, I saw that. And that passed, right?
It did. It passed with 65% of the vote.
That's amazing.
So that tells us that the city is interested. It's something that they want. I think that we see a lot of mobilization around it. There are pushbacks in certain areas or from certain populations. But I think in general, when people are given these items to test themselves, overwhelmingly the response is positive. So once people start like using the infrastructure or have adjusted to the idea of the infrastructure being built, I think that they come back happier.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's very often the case. I know that there's so many, when I read about the history of any urbanist projects, anything from like when bike lanes were reintroduced to Amsterdam in the 80s to when like Copenhagen wanted to make streets pedestrianized, there was massive pushback from people. But after it happens, people are overwhelmingly happy with it because it really is better, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's such an interesting example because now we think of Copenhagen as the mecca of pedestrianized cities. But I think Los Angeles, I think North America too, I can't really speak to Europe because before I worked at Streets for All, I worked in housing a little bit. And I think we really suffer from like consultant culture.
Yeah.
Where government consultants are paid lots of money to do feasibility studies that take, 10 years. And so there really is, I don't know, but there is a lot of political gridlock around projects like this, projects around housing. It's a very strange, also it's a really big city, obviously. And I'm sure that contributes to how hard it is to build anything. But yeah, very interesting. And I think it's good that the city wants to take feedback from its citizens and, test what people are feeling. But I think at a certain point, maybe building first might be better.
This is something that is very, very
Highly
relatable.
debated.
The thing is, like, it's relatable for me because I did advocacy, safe streets advocacy, cycling advocacy in Toronto. My wife was actually on the board of directors of Cycle Toronto. So we were like really involved in that stuff. And it was a lot of the same thing. It was very frustrating that, whenever you wanted to do a bike lane or like some pedestrian project or something like that, there was this whole ordeal and you needed to involve everybody and bring them all together. And that, it's great. You need to have some community consultation. But the thing that was frustrating to me is that when there was some car project,
It just went through.
yeah, people would argue about the costs of various things, but it pretty much just went through. Like they didn't have 19 public meetings about it. It wasn't happening. The traffic engineers come in with their projections and it's like, oh, traffic engineers have their projections. Let's go. But the traffic engineers, as I've said before in videos, traffic engineers are paid to build roads. They're not paid to not build roads, right? So, of course, they're going to come and say, we got to build more roads. And so that was always the most frustrating part to me is that, like, I appreciate that we do need to involve the community and stuff like this, but it does get to a ridiculous degree sometimes.
Yeah, and I think to your point about road building, I think that the contrast there is what stands out to me, where it's like highway widening projects are pushed through with like very little community involvement, and something like a bike lane takes 6 meetings to get put in. And then I think there's also the question about what kind of citizens can participate in those surveys, are available to come to public meetings. I think when we look at like the average income of who is taking public transit in Los Angeles, it's very low. And I think that those people are probably less likely to be reached by those surveys than like a homeowner would be.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think there's a couple of things there. I did find, in some cities in the US, those public meetings happen during the day. Like they'll literally happen at 2 p.m. or something
sometimes
like
they do,
that.
or they happen at 5 p.m. and they're in person.
Yeah, they'll happen like right at 5 p.m. Yeah. In Toronto, they were pretty good about that, I have to admit. Like they would typically be at 7 p.m. or something like that. So it gave people a chance to go. But when you do one of those, community outreach meetings and it's only published in certain places that it's even happening, and then it's at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, it's not really surprising that a bunch of retirees show up who complain about parking, and these boomers who grew up with like really, really steeped in car culture, like listening to the Beach Boys and stuff like that about their Giddy Up 409 and stuff. And they come in and they're like, oh, yeah, nobody's going to take these bikes, and it's infuriating. It is difficult to get the right people there because, as you said, especially low-income people who may be taking transit in Los Angeles, they're going to be spending an awful lot of their time working and taking care of their kids and sitting on transit, right? And they don't have time to sit at a public consultation meeting for 2.5 hours, even if it is when they're not working.
Yeah. I mean, totally agree. And I think that's a real reason why things tend to get so stalled. I think a good PR line would be to talk to retired homeowners and tell them how their property values might increase with public transportation or bike lanes and stuff. So I'm wondering, just in my personal capacity, if there isn't a way to reach those boomers who... And I also think California is an incredibly aging population.
Yeah.
By 2030, we're projected to have 5 million people over the age of 80 in California.
Wow.
I know. And so those people will lose mobility. And we know that people tend not to relinquish their license until something bad happens, like an accident. And they also lose a lot of agency, personal agency, once they can't drive themselves around anymore or drive themselves safely. And so I think infrastructure as like an aging population solve, I think that would be a good way to pitch it as well.
Yeah, I think that would be interesting. I know that there's often the talk about your property values going up, but I think the last thing California needs is property values to go up even more. Like,
but that's what those people care about.
I know that's what people care about. I know. I lived in Silicon Valley. I know those shitty little bungalows that are like $3 million. And I'm like, they're really bad.
They're really bad. I think people of my age in California have basically resigned themselves to being shut out of the housing market. And I used to work in housing prior to working at Street Sprawl.
Yeah.
And I made that switch because the housing landscape seemed so bleak and was very difficult for me emotionally. And infrastructure, like bike lanes, mobility infrastructure is more hopeful, I think, because I really see a lot of political will around it. It's not quite as contentious as a lot of the housing conversations. And also we have the Olympics coming up. And I'm like, we kind of need to get it done no matter what. And hopefully it's permanent infrastructure, not temporary infrastructure, as so often happens with Olympics. Yeah,
true. I mean, the Olympics is an opportunity to at least build some good transit because you're going to need to bring a lot of people in.
I know. I think if we don't do something, there will be like a dozen Europeans who are mowed over in traffic because they just don't understand.
Yeah, that's really kind of scary that it does happen.
It does happen. It's absolutely terrifying. And it's closer. I mean, it's 3 years away. And I have never, in the 10 years I've lived here, I've never seen California complete a project in 3 years.
Well, I mean, anything's possible. With the right motivation and incentives, that can happen.
Yes. And maybe that'll happen under a time crunch. Maybe that's the right motivation.
Yeah. So I don't want to be too negative here because I already do that on Not Just Bikes a lot. I'm infamous for that. But can we talk a little bit about some of the wins you've had at Street Sprawl? Because I know you mentioned the HLA, and that definitely was a win. So maybe we can start with that, and you can talk about some other wins.
Sure. Like I said, I think that there is a ton of political will right now for mobility justice and transportation improvement. I run our volunteer program, and we have like 4 to 8 people sign up every week.
Nice.
There's a lot of people who are interested in seeing a healthier, safer Los Angeles. Like we mentioned previously, last March, we put a ballot on the Measure HLA. Essentially, this is a ballot measure that would force the city to follow its own mobility plan when repaving streets. So like the TLDR on that is that in 2015, the city of Los Angeles put a mobility plan to voters. The voters passed it, and they haven't been doing a great job of keeping up with it or breaking ground on certain things. And so this essentially would force the city's arm in doing that and making sure that it implements those mobility improvements. And that passed with 65% of the votes. That tells us that people are not just interested, but passionate about, seeing those improvements made.
That is really encouraging.
Yeah, it is really encouraging. And I think people really care about healthy neighborhoods. And by that, I mean like neighborhoods where people can walk and their kids can walk and they can feel safe from traffic violence.
I found that the kids angle really does resonate with people. And I can appreciate that being a parent myself, because I know when I would cycle around Toronto, like I think I first started cycling when I had a job, that it was just so painful to get to on public transit. It was faster to cycle, which is why I did it. And I remember thinking at the time, like, my God, I can't believe I'm an adult and I'm cycling, because I had grown up in a car-dependent place where only kids ride bikes. But I would ride the bike, and I found that my tolerance for bad bike infrastructure was pretty high. And, I'd be like, I don't know if we need bike lanes. I mean, I could just go down the street here, just fine, just take the lane, whatever. But then once you have kids, you're like, oh shit, for 2 reasons. One of them is that you're like, there's no way in hell I want my kid cycling there. Like, that's insane. The other one is that I'm like, maybe I shouldn't die because now I have children to take care of, you know? So both of those things together is incredible motivation to say, no, we really, really do need to make this a lot better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think two things. I think firstly, kids also deserve a city that is safe for them.
They really do. Like, genuinely, like, yeah, that should not be a controversial statement, right?
No, not at all. Not at all. And I really think of children as almost an endangered class. Like they are so at the mercy of the adults around them.
Yeah.
Their parents, their school system, their neighborhood, and their city. And so if they can't safely ride bikes in the street or on the sidewalk or in bike infrastructure, I think that that is a failure.
Definitely.
And I have a lot of conversations with parents who like don't feel safe with their kid biking, even if they're together. I have a lot of conversations with parents who don't feel safe letting their kids go trick-or-treating on Halloween. And so they end up doing like a trunk or treat, which is, I think, such a sickness.
I think, yeah, trunk or treat, when I read about that, I did actually a video for my Patreon supporters about Halloween several years ago, 4 years ago, I think it was. And I did a bunch of research on that. And there were two things that were really depressing. The first was that trunk or treat. It was kind of like, really? That's what we're doing? Like,
Yeah, we've ceded so much of our public life to cars.
yeah.
So much so that instead of enjoying the holiday, we're having our kids like walk around a parking lot.
Yeah. And I think that's just so sad because I remember my favorite part about Halloween when I was a kid was walking door to door and seeing all the cool decorations on the houses and all the other kids. That was so much fun. But the other thing is that, yeah, Halloween is the number one day for child deaths in the United States.
It's the most
because
dangerous.
There's so many of them killed by cars.
Exactly. And the number one killer of children in California is cars.
That's so messed up.
Which is an insane statistic. And I'm also still a nanny. I nanny kids who I love a lot. And every Halloween, we have a long conversation about safety and being safe around cars and how we're not crossing the street back and forth. We're going down one side, we're crossing together, and we're coming back up the other side.
Yeah.
And my second point to that is that I listened to this, maybe it was a Throughline podcast, but one episode, it was 99% invisible maybe, but it was essentially how the Netherlands, how they got all of their amazing infrastructure was that they made a real campaign around childhood deaths and how cars were killing kids.
Yeah, it was called Stop the Kindermoord.
Yes, exactly.
Stop the child murder, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, I mean, obviously it's gruesome and it's very dark and it's hard to think about, but I think that that's how seriously we need to be taking what I see as a public health crisis.
Yeah, I think that needs to be highlighted all the time when it comes to this kind of thing, for sure. It just has to be. Like, I mean, it's just not right that we build cities that aren't safe for kids. It's just wrong.
Yeah.
However, the Stop the Kindermoord, the thing is, I hear a lot about that. I actually talked about that in my last video for Not Just Bikes. The Stop the Kindermoord was very successful in the Netherlands, but it actually came from the United States, from something called the baby carriage blockades, which was in the 40s and 50s.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and it was the same thing. It was that parents were pissed off that children were being killed by cars, and they blocked the streets with baby carriages.
What was the effectiveness of it? Like, did it, I mean,
not
obviously
really.
not long-term effective.
No, it didn't work out. But, the thing is, part of the reason why that was effective in the Netherlands was a little bit of good timing, too, because it also happened around the time of the oil crisis in the 1970s. And they had to institute car-free days because there just wasn't enough gasoline.
Gas was so expensive, yeah.
Yeah, well, not even expensive, just it was not
enough
there.
to go around,
like, literally, like, the gas stations ran out of gas. So I think there were a bunch of things that came together. So I've said before, like, the Stop the Kindermoord is certainly one thing, and that's an element of it. But I don't think that on its own will work. I think it has to be multifaceted. It has to be so many different pieces to come together. And you do have to get a little bit lucky, to be honest. You do have to have the right city councilors in place. You have to have the right financial situation. Then the Olympics might be one of those opportunities, right? Like, there are other things that can come along that can stack on top of all this stuff, right? Because it might not work on its own, but that might be the thing that just brings it up over the threshold.
Absolutely. I mean, I think obviously it's a multi-pronged approach for housing and for transportation and mobility infrastructure. And I think, Streets for All is a nonprofit, but we're also a political PAC. And that's something that's really interesting about us because we can do all of the wonderful things that nonprofits can do, but then we also can do political work, like, raise money and donate it to candidates and run election ads and canvass and door knock and phone bank. And obviously the national election this year was hard for everyone, but I really do think that we had a good year locally and we managed to get progressive majorities in a good handful of important districts. And we managed to elect a lot of really exciting or re-elect, really supportive people of that stuff. And so I think along with like community organizing around these ideas a politically pronged approach has to happen. And you're right, it does all have to like line up. And unfortunately, Los Angeles is in a bit of a budget crisis at the moment. And so we're missing that financial aspect.
Well, that can actually work sometimes to your favor because the truth is that this walking, cycling stuff is the cheapest stuff you can build. I remember there's a quote that Brent Todarian, he's a guy that does a lot of good advocacy, but he's the former chief planner of Vancouver. And he likes to quote the mayor of Copenhagen back from, I think it was the 70s, where they were like, how can we afford all of this bike infrastructure? And he said, we don't have any money. We can't afford not to. Like, this is the cheapest thing we can possibly build. If I go build a road project, it's going to be, millions and millions. If I build bike lanes, it moves many, many more people for less. And so if you can turn that around, the problem that I find in North America is that kind of the car budget is there. And there's this massive, like in Toronto, the transportation services budget, if I remember correctly, was $5 billion. But like, then we would be arguing over this like $120,000 bike lane project, right? It's like, if you can get them to like acknowledge the fact that that car stuff is insanely expensive, then the finances can actually work to your benefit.
Absolutely. I think the issue is it's such a baked in expense.
Yeah. And that's the issue.
Yeah. Well, it's almost not even a question. It's just baked into the expectation. And I think two things. I think firstly, what's interesting is that cars cause so much wear and tear on roads so that we have to repave them.
Yep.
Whereas like bikes are much lighter. And I think California has a lot of EVs now, which are very heavy. And that causes a lot of road wear and tear. And we would not see that if we invested in metro lines and bike lanes. And then I think, secondly, and somebody just said this to me recently, and I hadn't thought about it this way, but our metro is almost like a political arm, and it's sort of a job creation project. And so when they think about what they're going to fund, they're going to think about like political popularity and job creation. And if that means like choosing a heavy rail over a light rail, or if that means like doing a road construction project versus a bike lane, like that's probably what they'll pick.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's so many elements of this. It is incredibly complicated. And one of the issues I find is that, like, just like you were talking about with the consultants, there are a bunch of people who work in this current structure and they get paid to do things in that current structure. And so they want to keep working within that current structure. And you're sometimes pushing against that as well. But if you can turn those incentives around, and I think your ballot measure on HLA was very encouraging because it starts to show that like people do genuinely want this stuff when they're given the choice. And I think you find this with a lot of political issues. Like people will, in the US, obviously it's very polarized to be Democrats and Republicans. But when you actually break it down and you start talking about individual issues, people really do agree on a lot more than you'd think.
Absolutely. I like to think that infrastructure is apolitical. That's sort of how I like to worm into certain conversations because I think it benefits everybody. Similarly to when I was like working in food and housing, I run a soup kitchen still in Koreatown every Tuesday. And like, obviously we know that free food is inherently political.
Yeah.
But the way that I run my soup kitchen is very apolitical because it's something everybody typically agrees on is that, people deserve to eat. And I get a lot of kids that come and kids deserve to eat. And so I think like community-based organizations have a really interesting opportunity, especially post-election when people are sort of falling away from supporting national parties. I think community-based organizations have an incredible chance to do projects that serve everyone and are on the surface sort of without political leaning. And when we have healthy communities, we can then move on to having discussions about like what party does what for us. But I think really like the rubber needs to meet the road, and the political is sort of our everyday actions, our everyday choices. And like my personal politic is much stronger than my national politic or my party allegiance, because my personal politic is that I love my neighborhood. I want it to be healthy. I want it to be safe. And like, I want families to live here and I want old people to live here and I want everybody to have access to the things that they need.
Right. Yeah. This is also something that I see that people, even when they talk about the politics of it, people very often focus at the federal level. And obviously, people would be disappointed with the outcome of the federal election in the United States with Donald Trump getting elected. And that's not going to be good for things like public transit. It's just not. But what I find is that people don't care enough about their municipal elections and their neighborhood level things. And that does frustrate me because what happens at the high level, I mean, yeah, they make funding decisions and stuff like that. And that can certainly affect what happens with respect to, California high-speed rail and those big mega projects and stuff like that. But when it really comes down to it, it's the local stuff that's going to affect you most closely. And that's where you need to spend a lot more time. And I really, really, this is one thing I tell people, I really wish people would just come out and vote in their like municipal elections and be more involved locally because that matters so much more. Like you can carve out a nice neighborhood and a nice city for yourself, regardless of what's happening in the rest of the world.
Absolutely. And I think it's very empowering. And I think something I love about Los Angeles is that we've had a lot of those elections now that I've seen go really well.
Right.
Like we have a city comptroller, Kenneth Mejia, who is excellent and who has really called the city to account about how it's spending its money. And he is the one who really illuminated the consultant crisis and how we're losing all this money to consultants who can't account for how they spent it. And before he ran, I don't know anybody that cared about that position.
Right.
And he was able to reach young people. He was able to reach all different kinds of people and make it cool to care about and cool to go vote. And it really made people excited about this position that I doubt that they even knew about prior to that election.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of really good local politicians. Like, I know people get really negative about politics, and I can understand why. There's a lot of bullshit in politics. And, people will always say, oh, politicians, they're all the same. They all lie and stuff like that. And whatever. But when I look at local politics are very different. Like, if you're just somebody that wants to make it rich by becoming a politician and taking bribes and stuff like that, or you just want the power of it, you go for the big politics.
Absolutely.
The people who go for the local politics are the ones who genuinely care about what's going on, for the most part. I mean, there are still some people who cozy up to developers, but I think a lot of those people really do genuinely care.
Absolutely. And I think that's a way to return, like, hope to ourselves and also return, like, agency to ourselves is knowing that your vote in a local election really does matter. You can always run for your neighborhood council, which is a way to, make decisions that affect you that you can see tangibly. And also it's a way to I feel like my vote on down ballot stuff has had such an effect on the city. And because that's the only reason I think that I keep being interested in politics is because I know firsthand just how effective a handful of votes can be in those races.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This reminds me of, I was looking through some information years ago about how Amsterdam had a plan to run a highway right through the center of the city. And they were going to bulldoze a bunch of houses. And I mean, it was shit. Like you look at the plan, it was awful. They literally brought in an American traffic planner to make the plan. It was horrible. But you look at it at the time, and it's not like there were some people who were horrified by this idea, but there were a lot of people who were like, no, this is the future. This is the modernity. We need to catch up to the United States. They're doing it right over there. They've got the suburbs. And so there was that attitude. And when you look at it, the reason it didn't pass came down to like a handful of votes in city council, like sometimes as little as one or two. And it's like, holy shit. Like that is the kind of thing that would just fundamentally destroy the city. And it came down to just a couple of people. And this is why I say to people, like, for the love of God, please vote for better local city councilors, because it really does make a difference.
It really, really makes a difference. And it's terrifying to know that, 2 votes or 3 votes, or sometimes in certain elections, literally 5 votes.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I am sort of a stickler with my friends about them turning in their ballots. And I'll make a big point to go around and check in with people and collect, because our local projects are like my current city council representative, Hugo Soto Martinez, is amazing. And he just put in a bike lane on Hollywood Boulevard. And this is a different council district, but supposedly there's one coming through West Hollywood on my street. And I'm like, my vote did that. That feels awesome.
That is great.
It's so great. And it feels so good. And it really makes me feel like the work we do is important and it's possible. Whereas sometimes in housing, I was like, is what we're looking for even like, it felt like such an uphill battle.
Yeah.
And it was so disappointing. And you said no way more times than you were saying yes to people who it was like life and death for. And I don't necessarily feel that way with transportation and mobility issues. I feel very hopeful about it. I feel like we've had so many wins. We are a statewide organization. And this year we put 9 bills into the legislature and 5 became law. Our office is literally like 3 people. And so we have such an impact, and it's really, really inspiring and empowering.
Yeah, that is absolutely amazing. I love hearing about that. Yeah, it really can happen. This is why these local groups are so incredibly important.
Absolutely. And I feel like it's really important to invest in place. And so if you love a city, if you like being somewhere, I think being an integral part of it via community work is sort of what you owe that spot.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I am curious here as we're getting a little bit close to the end. I want to talk about Los Angeles because I know that a lot of people who have never been to Los Angeles really just know Los Angeles for Hollywood and like crippling car traffic. And that's about it. So, talk a little bit about the things that are great about Los Angeles.
I love Los Angeles. I live in Hollywood, and often I describe myself as a Hollywood truther, which means that a lot of people will think of Hollywood as a bad neighborhood, as dirty is what you hear it described as a lot. I don't think that's true. I think the rents are just still low, which is why I love it, but it's very walkable.
Hmm.
Within walking distance, like under, I would say, zero point 0.7 of a mile. I have 4 Michelin star restaurants. I have a Pilates studio. I have a yoga studio. I have a sauna place. I have the best farmers market in Los Angeles. And I have 5 really good coffee shops.
Yeah. That's incredible. I find that because there's several little pockets of Los Angeles that are like that because Los Angeles is a fairly old city and it does
Yes.
have a lot of these traditional neighborhoods.
I think basically the rule of thumb when talking about Los Angeles is people say the neighborhoods are walkable, but getting from one to another is not. And I would say that's generally true. But we have a fairly good metro system, better than one might expect having heard about Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And it's the best city in the world to ride your bike. The weather is amazing. And I think culturally, it's my favorite place that I've ever lived. It's like the best food. Yeah, such interesting neighborhoods. Really like such a diverse place, which is probably why the food is so amazing.
It's absolutely why the food is so amazing. Yeah, like Toronto is the same thing. There's so many people from so many different cultures. And I say, like, I explain this to Europeans because Amsterdam food is okay because it's a tourist hotspot, but Toronto is much better because, as I say, they have lots of immigrants who know how to make the food and enough immigrants who know how it's supposed to taste to keep those places in business.
So true.
Yeah.
So true. Yeah. I mean, the fabric of the city is very, very rich. And sometimes driving in Los Angeles or walking around, I went to Italy for the first time this summer to the Italian coast. And part of me was like, I see this in LA. I mean, obviously there are things that were much better about it, but like, I read this amazing book called Cadillac Desert this year, which is about getting water in the West. And when LA was first settled, they called it the New Mediterranean or the Mini Mediterranean because it was so evocative of that landscape. And obviously it's different in certain ways and it's, worse in certain ways. But I just feel like it's a really special place and any kind of experience that you want in LA, you can have.
All right. Well, I think that's as good a place as any to end it off, to be honest, on a high note about Los Angeles, because I've certainly had some good times in Los Angeles. I've had some bad times too, but I've had some good times. And I think it does get a bad rap. It has a lot more potential than you might think. So thanks so much for coming on to the show. I really appreciate it. And maybe we can have you on again sometime if there's something in particular that Streets for All is doing that's worth talking about to a wider audience. Obviously, everything you do is worth talking about, but to a wider audience. And yeah, if you're in Los Angeles or California, make sure you check out Streets for All. Anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, go to our website, streetsforall.org. If you hit the volunteer button, you can schedule a meeting with me. I onboard all of our new volunteers.
Nice.
And we're always looking for people. We're working on really cool projects. Yeah, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks so much. And if you haven't checked out I Love the City yet, then do that as well. Ellery's first episode is about libraries, and it's excellent, and it's very funny. It had me like literally laughing out loud while I was recording it.
Okay, that makes me very happy.
Yeah, it's good. So thanks so much for coming on, Ellery.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to the Urbanist Agenda. As usual, all new episodes will be available early on Nebula. So if you're not already a Nebula subscriber, now might be a good time. You can sign up at nebula.tv/agenda. And with a subscription to Nebula, you not only support this podcast, you also get access to content by over 150 creators. That's everything from videos to podcasts to classes and more.
Nebula is also constantly adding new Nebula originals, which are high-budget productions on a wide range of interesting topics. If you use our link, which again is nebula.tv/agenda, you'll get a discount on a yearly subscription, which brings it down to only $30 a year. I'm a big fan of Nebula, which is why all of my Not Just Bikes videos are available there, as well as some that are only available on Nebula, and of course, all episodes of the Urbanist Agenda. So if you're not already a Nebula subscriber, go check it out today, and thanks again for listening.